Good evening and welcome to Inform Interiors, to our first virtual book launch. We are so excited to have you join us this evening. So excited to be giving you an insight into this amazing home and the book about the home. And I want to thank my staff who have just done a phenomenal job getting ready for this evening. And I want to thank School of Architecture, Landscape Architecture at UBC, and Leslie Van Duzer, who I am going to turn the floor over to.
Hi, Nancy. Well, this is almost like old times, but not quite. We miss so much the Inform City living room where we've been able to gather with you and your colleagues so many times in the past. But thank you very much for hosting us virtually. And thank you, Michael Young, for performing your behind the scenes magic for us tonight. Tonight, we are celebrating the publication of the 8th and final book in the Sala West Coast Modern House series, McIntyre House by Dr. Sherry McKay. So just when we thought we were finished with this series, it was James Chang that encouraged us to do this one last book. And we would like to thank James for that prompt and for his very generous support. We also want to thank our donors, Gillick Development, Merrick Architecture, and Greg Borofsky for making this book possible. Finally, we extend our gratitude for Doug Copeland, who has passed many evenings in the McIntyre House, for his intimate preface for the book. For those of you who are interested in purchasing the book, you can order a copy on Inform's website. So it's most fitting that Sherry McKay has written the final book in this series. Not only has she been involved with the series from the beginning as a co-curator and co-editor, but she has a deep knowledge of West Coast architecture. Most recently, she published a chapter entitled West Coast Land Claims in the book Canadian Modern Architecture, 1967 to the Present, published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2019. In addition to her research on West Coast architecture, she's published her research on French architecture of the modern colonial period in international journals. She's published essays in numerous museum catalogs and was the organizer and catalog author of Assembling Utopia, Packing the Home, presented at the Canadian Embassy in Tokyo. Very sadly for us, Sherry retired from UBC last year, a beloved teacher who served as the inaugural chair of Sala's architecture program from 2006 to 2009, and a teacher who garnered the prestigious Killam Teaching Award. Sherry is currently working on 2 projects. She's exploring the notion of building fictions, that is, history told via the material vicissitude, and sorry, I have trouble with that word, and appropriations of architecture. And she is writing a book with Associate Professor Annalisa Mayboom for Rutledge, exploring the value of design in infrastructure and its ability to accrue design capital over time. So on behalf of my colleagues and the students in Sala, we miss you, Sherry, and are so happy to be together again, if only virtually and only for one night. So now over to you.
Well, thank you, Leslie, for that very nice welcoming remarks. So today I'm going to talk about the McIntyre House, and that will be followed by a conversation with McIntyres at the McIntyre House, which is one of the benefits of this virtual world that we now are invited into, if unexpectedly. So I will speak for about 30 minutes on the house, and then we will have a conversation with the McIntyres and a sort of question and answer conversation. And that will be followed by my thank yous to some of the people that have been involved in the project, And we will also have a chat section where people can send us their questions about the house or things that they've heard this evening. So with that, let us begin. So I'm going to bring on the images of the house, and let's just see if I can manage that. Okay. So I have to ask, is the image coming up? No. Okay, sorry. I see it now. It was gone. Whoops. Back. So let's begin. When I first visited McIntyre House on Cartellier Place, this is what I encountered. McIntyre House is, to the right of the image, not yet quite revealed. I remember a sun-filled ascent up the slopes of the North Shore along the expanse of Delbrook Avenue, and then turning into Cartellier Place. Suddenly, light levels fell, the air cooled, and tall trees encroached above. It was like entering a different world. McIntyre House at first appears vaguely familiar. Peaked roof, a gable, a front porch, a picture window, wood construction, a garden. But the gable is split open. The window floats high up by the roof line. The porch is a bridge across a steep incline between road and house. And the garden is a forest. It is also vintage West Coast modern architecture circa 1973. Lois Milsom, pictured here, the developer of Cartellier Place, came across the site. When she did so, it was a tangle of ferns, tall trees, and shafts of light. It was both on an incline and cut through with ravines carrying fish-bearing creeks. But it was here that she envisioned housing that was responsive to its local ecology, economical in construction, and ingenious in design. She imagined a landscape differently than did the loggers of the late 19th century who, inattentive to Coast Salish practices that had preceded them, had seen the forest as raw material for the nearby mill in Moodyville, and who had depleted the timber by 1901. The North Shore was also the site of previous modern architecture experiments. Fred Hollingsworth neo-terrace houses, often associated with property development, were exceptions to the usual provision of conventional subdivision fare in the 1950s and 60s. Cartellier Place was more in line with the thinking of the early 1970s that saw the establishment of the Agricultural Land Reserve and Capilano Hatchery, and with False Creek Park and False Creek South in Vancouver, which proposed at the same time new forms of housing and transformed an industrial landscape into a more benign one. McIntyre House was inserted into a neighborhood already constituted by banal suburban developments of replicated rectangular houses centered within expanses of lawn, their decks well clear of trees and elevated high to catch the sun and straining for the distant view. Cartellier Place was a critique of such developments, which echoed that of innovative artists of the time. Most relevant here, perhaps, was Ian Wallace's Mélancolie de la Rue, which represented just such melancholy subdivisions of houses replicated across leveled topographies. Cartelier Place was an innovative proposition for living on the periphery of the city with a re-envisioned density within ecologically sensitive topography. The site plan would be eventually subdivided into 6 building lots, each configured and dimensioned by the particularities of the landscape. Each house is accommodated to its localized topography, the fall of the land, the path of the creeks, the arc of the sun. Some houses were built speculatively, but McIntyre House, Lot B, was commissioned, a modest 1,500 square feet at a reasonable cost, somewhere around $20 a square foot. The architects of Cartelier Place, Robert Hassel and Barry Griblin Associates, responded to the challenges of the terrain via a serviceable post and beam structure that you see here, and a relatively inexpensive shell. The houses shared a common philosophy and formal vocabulary, aiming for inexpensive houses by economies won from construction savvy and spatial resourcefulness, while being responsive to climate and the character of the region. The houses of Cartelier Place sought affordability in design rather than just reduced square footage or the economies of mass production. So here we see it under construction with, I believe that's Barry Griblin's shadow as he takes the photograph. McIntyre House in the foreground, like the others of Cartelier Place, participates in the West Coast idiom, timber post and beam construction that afforded point supports allowing building on uneven terrain, wood planed, oiled, rough-hewn, integration of interior and exterior via generous glazed surfaces and decks extending from or recessed within a taut building envelope, a continuity of materials from inside to out. So here you see the two compared. You can note the carport buried beneath the judiciously planted shrubbery in the front of McIntyre House, for example. The house responds to landforms and vegetation, rain, and the quality of light presented by a forest. The carport is tucked into the fall of the land. The deck extends southward, engaging trees and shrubs. You can just see it behind the grill work of the fence. And the recessed deck shelters an entry. Over time, the house has allowed adaptations, the addition of skylights, the appropriation of deck space for a hallway expansion, and some judicious planting has augmented the forest. The house is compact, traverses the site with a certain pragmatism, supports as needed, access to the ground where possible. The house is sited to deftly avoid encroaching on Mission Creek or to avoid the removal of significant trees and to appropriate the slope of the land for maximum effect and pragmatic distribution of functions. McIntyre House is lifted above the damp watercourse in Bridges' uneven terrain, while skylights and simple shed-roofed bays capture the light. The exterior offers a rather austere expanse of patinaed wood. It is unforthcoming of the revelation of the interior. Within space expands vertically in a number of half levels, interlacing public living spaces and distributing more private ones above and below. The interior proffers a surprising array of interlocking volumes and unexpected views beyond a parapet, across expanses opened up by the deletion of walls, and upward through skylights to the forest above. You can just see glimpses of green. Space dilates in the double height of the living room, flows up to the kitchen and the dining room, and slips through stair treads. It compresses beneath a horizontal stretch of balcony or within a vertical column of stairwell. It is also customized to the McIntyres, a librarian and a publisher, with initially a small child who will grow up in the house. The dynamic space within is created by the 5 half levels that segregate public and private space. So the entryway is in the center of the house. That's where we come in from the street view that we saw earlier. And then it's down a half a level to the kitchen and dining room, down a half level to the living room. And then bracketing those, below is the bedroom and playroom, and at the very top, under the roof, the bedroom and study. So these half spaces allow this segregation of private and public space and also negotiate the gradient of the site. The vertical stacking of spaces affords both a nearness to the ground plane and the forest canopy, and attentiveness to the form and fall of the land. This interior space is enlivened and enlarged by glimpses of elsewhere, the diurnal path of the sun, or the seasonal changes of foliage. West Coast modern architecture, so often associated with the horizontal ordering of space, is enhanced by the experience of vertical extension, of space spiraling centrifugally around a central core, a succession of varied illumination. Rather than a commanding view of a distant horizon, the house provides intimate glimpses of nature, moss, lichen, and the detritus of the forest floor focused up close. It encourages an embrace of the irregularities of the land, enhanced by the framing devices of a deck, a step, a bench, a window. Needles accumulate on the skylights and ferns encroach on the deck. McIntyre House celebrates the immediate proximate landscape, not the distant view, and the reassurance of its horizon. It offers treetops seen at eye level, the delight of the detail, and the comfort of enclosure. The house puts the occupant up close to the textured bark and branches of cedar, the changing color of flat-leaf vine maples, and the lacy green of ferns. It is not the singular expanse of the sublime, but the episodic of the picturesque. The careful consideration of the ecology of the site is not an insular or idiosyncratic effort. It was part of an environmental awakening of the late 60s and early 70s, like Sea Ranch along the California coast. McIntyre House and Cartier Place as a whole tested the relationship between profitable real estate development and architecture as a form of land stewardship. These architectural innovations provided alternatives to the template replication of conventional subdivisions of the preceding decades. McIntyre House is at home with the damp and the dark, with forest debris and the spongy invasions of moss. It accommodates the waywardness of a free-flowing watercourse and embraces its acoustical presence. The house is accepting of the commonly uncelebrated and often excluded forces of nature. In 1973, Cartelier Place was attentive to the ecological aspects of architecture's engagement with the environment and real estate before legislation and professional bodies recognized the importance of such considerations. While the house itself is one version of West Coast modern architecture, it is also part, literally and metaphorically, of a larger modern West Coast cultural endeavor. The indigenous materials of which it is composed curate a modern West Coast cultural endeavor. The indigenous materials are also in consonant with other kinds of cultural commitments of the time. There are paintings and prints of Gordon Smith and Robert Davidson, among others, artists who have expressed the coastal bearings of their interests. There are affinities to Davidson's, pictured here, and his mythical reference to place conveyed via abstract form, and Jack Shadbolt's celebration of the forest floor with carefully framed views of its offerings. These affinities are seen in walls of masterfully matched, straight-grained, first-growth red cedar, shown to dramatic effect in overheight walls, beams that soar overhead, and oak floors that provide a comfortable ground underfoot, and framed views of cedar boughs and sea pods. The presence of books distributed throughout the house, many of them McIntyre, Douglas and McIntyre imprints, many titles exemplified by the artwork, invoke life lived within the house, a human temporal dimension inserted into the seeming longevity of the forest. McIntyre House is a West Coast modern house which has enjoyed a committed tending of its material fabric and sensibility. It is the last in our series of West Coast modern houses. The series was begun because so many houses of this era were disappearing due to real estate values or other values. While the McIntyre House does not seem to be in danger of either neglect or property speculation, it is in other ways, if not threatened, then perhaps unheeded. Aspects of Cartelier Place would be impossible to replicate today. Certainly the first growth red cedar, of which the houses are largely composed, is unavailable, and such proximity to fish-bearing streams less possible. But the environmental concerns leading to their protection are in part a legacy of the awakening ecological sensitivities that can be recognized in the McIntyre House, and these sensitivities are something to heed. McIntyre House also contributes, it seems to me, an alternative to the current preoccupation with the view, the commanding, elevated surveillance of the landscape, of nature writ large. The close-up and partial glimpses of the forest, its damp and chiaroscuro, celebrate the often underappreciated aspects of the landscape. And finally, it also seems to me, it is significant that McIntyre House, as a product and producer of a cultural landscape, is inclusive of different stories, of simultaneous overlapping trajectories, a Davidson, a Shadbolt, a Wallace, and others, of the West Coast, which together have a certain contemporary currency that are also worth heeding. McIntyre House has been the residence of Scott and Corky McIntyre for some 45 years, and it is to them that I now turn our attention and a conversation about this house that has been their home for such a long time.
Are we, oh, there we are.
There we are.
Hi.
Well, hello.
Hi. Thank you, Sherry.
Nice to see you again.
Yes.
I have to say, just off the top, I mean, we are enormously grateful for all of the people who pulled together to allow this to happen. I mean, obviously you and Doug and Leslie as publisher,
Yes.
and James Chang, in fact.
Yeah.
This was an unexpected walk in the forest.
Well, thank you. So I just dropped my paper. Okay. I guess one of my first questions is what attracted you to this site? And what was it about the site perhaps that you thought this is a place I would like to live?
Do we want to do this sequentially? How are we going to do
No,
this? Or-
Scott can talk.
Oh,
first.
sure.
He'll
Well, look,
talk first.
I grew up here.
Yeah, we both do.
Aside from 2 years in Toronto and 6 months in Europe, this was our home in a way, and I grew up in the mountains. So that the forest, although I never liked the fact that it was as dark as it is, and of course it's much darker now, this was just a magic place, and it seemed to encapsulate both the architecture that I had come to admire and a landscape that felt like home, albeit too dark.
Oh, no. No, he loves it.
Corky, do you have anything to add to that?
I think what so surprised me when we first came across Cartelier Place was that the kinds of homes that I had seen in the occasional magazine actually existed. And when we walked into the first house which had been built, and I looked out, I thought, oh my God, this can actually happen. It's actually real. And I was so taken with it, I thought, God, I'd do anything to be able to live in a place like this. And then we were so lucky that a year later, when we had need of a home, that this property was around and we started this, what Scott would call a great adventure.
Yes.
A few years later, I actually spent a night in Sea Ranch with a friend, and it wasn't quite as edgy, I don't think, or as exploratory as these things were. But we didn't know what we were doing.
No.
We just fell in love with an opportunity and a place.
And a place. Yeah.
Well, what is amazing to me when, especially looking at the images, is it's almost not exactly surreal, but you suddenly see just a segment of a tree, or it's quite a different kind of experience of the landscape, which I found was quite unusual in your house, but also just very much brought you into that landscape. And the house seemed to orchestrate a kind of ballet of landscape forms, if you like, and a relationship to
that
it.
is true, Sherry. And I find myself several times throughout the day suddenly looking through a window and seeing those things, and the way the leaves are sitting on the branches, or the way the bark looks at that particular moment. And I'm always kind of taken aback that that's our yard.
Yes.
You know, it's not a yard.
Yes.
The
It's
irony of
something
all of this is,
extraordinary.
I thought, whoa, we won't have to cut lawns.
Yes.
It won't need upkeep. Walls will not need painting. Well, guess what?
It's a different kind of work.
Forest care is a bit more extreme from time to
Yes,
time.
I'm sure it is, but worth it.
Oh,
Absolutely.
absolutely. Yes.
So we've talked a lot about the landscape, but perhaps we could say something more about the actual design of the house. So, for example, the coming in sort of mid-house and the distribution of the spaces vertically. How have you found that? Was that something that appealed to you from the beginning, or?
I don't know if we ever actually really thought about it.
I don't think
in
we
that
focused
way.
on those things. We
No.
just thought
The
this
whole-
house is going to be amazing. We
Yeah.
trusted Bob, who
Yeah.
was obviously the lead architect.
Yeah.
And we kind of said, you know, do your thing given our
Yeah.
restricted financial resources.
And
Although we did
Yeah.
fight for things,
Yeah.
Corky did,
yeah,
Yes.
but
halls,
we had seen,
dining
as
room.
I mentioned, that first speculative home, and I
Yes.
think it was those spaces that were so appealing. The
Mhm.
fact that you had the feeling of a grandness and yet the occasional little intimate space. And that really, and even times if we've been away for a while traveling and we come home and I'm suddenly in the house, I think, oh my God, this really is, it's almost like walking around a piece of art,
Yes.
and being in it. And I know that whenever people come to the house and unexpected people, it could be a workman coming to, the plumber or something, and they walk in and they say, oh my God, it doesn't look like it from the street, but you come in and you get that sense that this is a different kind of space. And I think that's what it is. It's that
Mhm.
constant feeling that you're moving in space.
I think the street facade is unimpressive,
Mm-hmm.
not to mention all the weathered cedar. And people seem amazed when they come in. There's a whole world inside, but we had no idea
No.
this is how it how it would play out. It
Yes.
was simply that we trusted the architect and
Mm-hmm.
we kind of embraced to repeat the adventure.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is interesting because the house is very close to the street when you enter, so it's quite protective. And that the entryway, the sort of porch, is also like a drawbridge or a bridge to it.
And has been expanded some over
Yes,
the years.
yes, and then it opens up as soon as you get in the other side of the wall. So it has that kind of surprise effect as well.
I'll never forget a family member walking in and saying, "Oh my God, there's a huge mistake here. All the wood is inside out." Because the rough surfaces of the cedar were
Yes.
not necessarily loved by many people. And the other side is people say, well, how do you handle the stairs? And as we get older, which you can see, it's great because we run up and down all day, and it's effectively a stairmaster.
Yes. Yes.
An unexpected benefit.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. So I think, Corky, you were intimated that that there are things about that you had to fight for in the house.
Well, I wouldn't say fight for, but
I would.
no, I mean, absurd little things. I mean, as wonderful as architects as Bob and Barry were and still are, I'm sure. They were young and they weren't quite focused on what I would have called practical items like closets and that sort of thing. When I remember when I first mentioned to Bob that I wanted a linen closet, he said, well, why would you need that? You only have sort of one towel that's being used and the other towel is being washed. I said, well, I might have a few more. So I did persuade him to give me a linen closet and a few other small items like that. And what was really important to me actually was having the washer and dryer on the same floor as the kitchen. Because, like all of us who grew up that, lived in normal homes, all the washing materials were downstairs in the basement. And you went from the basement and you did that and you came all the way up the stairs and you went outside and you hung it on the laundry line. And that was fine. I didn't mind that when I was a little girl helping my mother. But I thought, no, I want it in my kitchen so that when I come home from work and I'm making dinner, I can also do the laundry. It turned out to be a really good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I
Of
mean,
course,
silly things like that.
we fought for wider hallways.
Right, so that we could put in bookshelves.
Which we didn't know at the time
Yeah.
would eventually be constrained with bookcases.
Yeah.
And I really pushed. I wanted a a dining room large enough to entertain in.
Right.
Which
And two separate eating areas. I wanted a place in the kitchen and a dining room as well, as opposed to a single eating space. Because that was just,
And a fireplace.
yes, a fireplace.
The fireplace was a big deal,
Yeah.
a big
Yes.
dare, in fact.
Yeah.
Well, it's a lovely central feature for the house. It just kind of grounds the space to some extent.
And Bob admitted, and the builder, John Lefebvre, they'd never done this before. And it required quite a stack of concrete in the basement to elevate it. And the first time we were newly in the house, Bob kind of arrived at the door. I think he won't mind me telling this story, and a bit timidly said, "Well, are you okay?" And we said, "Yeah." And basically, does the fireplace draw? And of course, it's brilliant and has been. It was perfect then, and it's still perfect.
It's still perfect.
These were all
Yeah.
unanticipated. Not adventures, I'm repeating myself, but
Yeah.
these were all things that they hadn't necessarily done before. And they all worked out.
Mm-hmm.
The conversation between the architect and the client can be,
Oh, yeah.
you
It
know,
was really,
highly
and what is
worthwhile.
interesting, Sherry, is that when the young couple that was building their home next door to us, when they came over to talk to us about the building of their own home, and I mentioned those few things, they said, "Oh, yeah, that's exactly what we want to do as well. So thanks for letting us know." And they managed to get those same things in their home because we had set the precedent. So they were able to get the fireplace and that sort of thing, which they loved.
And of course, you cannot build it's been years and years since you were able to
Build
to
a wood burning
build
fireplace.
a wood burning fireplace, certainly in
Yes.
North Vancouver and
Yeah.
probably on the North Shore.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can't have them in Vancouver either, except if you already have one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's our circumstance.
So one of the things that I noticed, and I think it probably came out in my talk, was that that the house itself, the artwork that you have collected, that seems to be a kind of conversation between them, or certainly a kind of shared sensibility. And I'm wondering if you concur with that, or?
I can certainly do that. Well,
Yeah.
absolutely. But this was not any kind of prejudged
No.
aesthetic principle. This was simply our taste. And given that I was publishing most of these people, Robert Davidson, Gordon Smith, Jack Shadbolt, Doug Copeland, between people gifting us things, and just the aesthetic meshed. But this was not a plan. It simply felt intuitively appropriate.
Yeah. And it's always been just who we are. So probably for the same reason that we built the house in the way that we did is the same reason why we collect and have the art that we do. It's just all part of a one sort of liking or aesthetic or whatever. And it just seems totally natural that that's what we would have. And people often sometimes comment on that, actually, and I don't even stop and think about it. You know, I mean, we've got a lot of Wayne
Nang, of course, yeah.
and other local things that just, yeah, they're here and we love them.
It was not any kind of grand scheme.
No.
It just felt right piece by piece.
It was not done by an interior decorator.
No.
It just happened.
Well, Gathy Falk, of course, that great piece in the dining room.
Yeah, that's right.
And these were our friends, some of them.
So one of the questions has come in from the audience, and they would like to know how the house has changed over the years.
Oh. Other than the fact that because the trees have gotten taller, the light has changed over in terms of what we see and what we feel. But the house itself hasn't really changed in many respects.
It hasn't disintegrated in the
No,
rain.
no,
No.
And
Yes.
certain spaces were pushed out. The decks have been improved.
yeah,
But it's effectively the space that we were blessed with to begin
Yeah.
with.
that's right.
Mhm.
And it fit us, small family.
But
Uh,
it does require a certain kind of care that you wouldn't have in a normal house, which is not something that we thought about when we first came, because you don't think about those things when you're young, and we just had a baby, and we're starting out in life, and you don't stop and think, what's my life going to be like in 25 years from now. But the house has stayed remarkably the same in many ways, and yet feels different because the exterior, the landscape has changed. And so the house itself feels like it has changed somewhat, but the actual spaces and that are the same. Yeah.
and in a way, not detritus, but the stuff around the house uh, reflects our travels, reflects Europe, Istanbul, all that stuff that we were blessed to be able to do. So it has acquired a patina of a
Mhm.
life, which it seems to me is kind of just blended in with the ideal of the place.
Mhm. Mhm. So have you, as the forest grows and it gets darker around the house,
Hmm.
have you had to adapt in the house in any way? Give you added like skylights and things like that, or?
Well, we did add the skylights in the living room
Mm-hmm.
for that reason, and that has made a huge difference. Um, but and very, very early on, we filled it. We made the entranceway that little bit bigger so
Mhm.
that we had a larger space for coming into the house. But that was done within a few years after we were actually in the house. But other
Mhm.
than that, no, those are the skylights in the living room have actually made a huge difference. And one of the things that I like about that is that when I get up in the morning and I go around the corner to come down the stairs, I see all of the trees and whatever through
Mhm.
those skylights. And sometimes it's just quite extraordinary,
Mhm.
and that in itself has changed the way the house feels, those kinds
Mhm.
of things.
And of course, because we're in North Vancouver, you cannot do anything in North Vancouver to trees. In the early days, we were able to top some. You
Right.
can't do that anymore. And we
No.
could corkscrew some.
Yeah.
So we debate how far we might go to persuade neighbors to agree to certain things, but you
Yeah.
can't take a tree down
No.
unless it's going to fall on the
Yeah.
house.
Right. And
And hey, it's the world we're in,
Yeah.
and we are so lucky.
well, yes.
Mhm. So when you get a storm passing through, I guess you really can.
Oh, we know it when there's a storm
You
passing.
can hear the wind
Yeah.
whistling, of course, up
No.
a
No.
southwest wind. Some of them are dangerous. We've never had a major tree fall on the house, but we have had branches go through skylights, for instance. Um, Occasionally in the winter, we will sleep in the lower level because you kind of think, if any of those things came down,
But
we're
no,
dead.
the biggest thing, of course, is the changing levels in the creek, because when the rains come, the boulders shift dramatically, and you do hear them. The creek goes in the summertime from what seems like just a small meandering little trickling charming little brook to a actually quite raging river, and it's quite extraordinary. It goes from like about 1 foot wide to about 10 feet wide, and several.
But it's even though we have a footing on the floodplain, well above it,
Yeah.
with a lot of concrete, um, it's never been a problem.
No, no.
Mhm.
But even when we built the house, I think Bob and Lois, they had looked at studies. I think they cited a Harvard study that they had looked at this for a long, long time, and it had never been a problem,
Right.
and it has never been. But it can be quite disconcerting on a winter's night when you hear this constant rumbling. And actually, Cork used to go into the creek,
Nice
and
job.
we had a neighbor who was a doctor who kind of said, you know, if one of those rocks hits you, your leg will snap like a twig. So we haven't spent as much time in the creek since, but that was a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the surprising things about the house is that when you read about Robert Hassel and Barry Griblin, when they talk about their buildings in the 1970s, they talk about building like a inexpensive. In one article, they were called budget houses. And to see
Absolutely.
your house, it does not seem like a budget house.
It doesn't, but that was, I mean, this was built, as you, I think, indicated, it was built for about $20 a square foot, which is absurd when it's
Yes.
first growth cedar. But these were houses theoretically were for kids with no money.
Yeah, yeah.
The lot, thanks to Lois, was reduced to under $20,000. I mean, this is a dream. Who could do that now?
Yes.
And we were a combination of, I don't know, prescient, probably not, lucky, certainly.
Mhm.
And so we just did it because we could. We had a
No,
friendly banker, amongst
that's
other
right.
things.
And as you say, I mean, one of the reasons why it doesn't look like a budget friendly house is because you can't obtain the materials anymore. So you cannot get first growth cedar anymore. At one point, when I had to have an insurance appraiser come and look at the house, well, she just didn't know where to start. She said, I mean, like, how could I possibly appraise this for replacement when you can't replace these things? So she did her best.
It didn't fit
but
the norms
no,
at all
no,
for anyone.
no.
Yet here we were, even with not a conservative, but a Bank of Montreal, wonderful woman who said, because Bob at one point said, you got a mortgage, but you know, nobody can read our plans. So you got repayments without evidence of sufficient progress. That's insane.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
we just all along the way, be it the combination, be it the period of history, be it whatever, maybe we're charming, I don't know. The fact is that we lucked out, and it all went smoothly, which you could not do now, I don't think.
Mhm. Probably not.
No.
Not to
I-
mention, it would cost 10 times as much.
Yes.
Well,
Oh,
and
or more than 10 times as much.
right, yeah, that's right. And you undoubtedly, as you mentioned, would probably not be able to build because of the proximity to the fish-bearing creeks. You know, this is what makes it more difficult,
Oh,
right?
after M Creek flooded, all the local regulations changed, so you could not build this house now.
No.
My understanding, and we've checked, you could rebuild it to the same footprint if disaster struck, but you certainly could not build from scratch or expand.
Yeah.
It
So,
was a magic time. We just got lucky.
well, so I was going to ask you that, you know, you've lived in the house for some 45 years and what the enduring qualities are of the house, but I think in some ways you already answered those questions, that you've just become very much still in love with your house. Is
Oh,
that right?
absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. Every time, you know, the occasional time that we contemplate, well, maybe we should think about selling, etc., for whatever the reason, we think, but it's just not possible to replicate the emotional attachment that we have to the place, to the house and the land. You know,
Mhm.
it just wouldn't be possible, you know, and so we don't want to give that up until we absolutely have to. drag us out of here screaming, right?
Yes. Well, those stairs are going to help you live there a long time.
Oh yeah,
They
I
are.
think
And
so.
that is,
I think
I'm
so.
quite serious that
Yeah.
this
It
is,
certainly
is
helps.
undoubtedly a
Yeah.
helpful physical
Well, and
add-on.
just being in the neighborhood, because the neighborhood, you know, we are in a hilly neighborhood, so just walking around the neighborhood, you get that as well.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I can't imagine living in a condominium. I mean, we are so extraordinarily fortunate and blessed, especially at the time we're in, to be able to
Mm-hmm.
have a place like this, you know. And we know
Definitely.
that and understand that completely.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just check if we have any more questions. No, I don't see any more questions. Do you have any comments that you would like to make about either the house itself or the kind of process even of us getting together and making the book? What are your ideas about the book or these small books on West Coast architecture? Are they was it an interesting project to have a
Oh,
house,
it
have
was
a
a
book
f-
written
Oh,
about?
I
it
guess
was
I
a
can speak to that. I
wonderful.
know, and Leslie's listening. I know once or twice I probably caused her to raise her ire a bit because I was acting like a publisher. And when there was thoughts of maybe we have to do this because that's what the printer said, of course I hit back and said, you don't, publishers don't
No.
take orders from printers. Um, but no, the whole process was, I can repeat, it sounds Pollyanna-ish, remarkable from beginning to end.
Yeah.
People of grace and sympathy and goodwill stretched
Yeah.
at every level.
Yeah. No, it was from that marvelous first meeting with James Chang at
Mm-hmm.
the Gordon Smith luncheon, where we happened to mention that we lived in this home. And he said, well, I'd love to see it. And he said, well, come over anytime. And that was the beginning. And it was way beyond anything we ever imagined. I mean, when we first got a copy of the book, I would sit in the house looking at the book and looking in the photographs and think, but this isn't real. This is a book about where I'm sitting, and it just felt
And you
quite
know
extraordinary.
the photography, Michael Perlmutter,
Perlmutter. Oh,
he was here and it was November and it was gray and we thought, can't we wait? Can't we bring him back when the leaves are out? As Doug Copeland sort of suggested at one point. But he was precise,
yeah,
focused,
yeah,
and disciplined. And I, having commissioned a fair number of architectural photographers in my career, I was thinking, okay, well, is this exceptional? Well, yes, he is, because when one looks at the house now and the images and his ability to capture light and emphasize the right light for the occasion, that's exceptional.
and the
Mm-hmm.
spaces, to be able to capture the spaces. I thought he did a marvelous job.
So
I
we
mean,
were
the
blessed
whole,
all
yeah,
around.
yeah, the whole process.
Yes.
You know, the
Well, that's
designer,
good.
the guy who did the line drawings,
Yeah,
certainly the photographer Michael,
Mm-hmm.
and we're it's a sadness that the original thought of bringing everybody here to have an event, but I gather there might still be one maybe in the spring post COVID if that ever happens, which I think is going to be much longer than people think, uh, for the entire series
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
and all of the people
Because
who
the
have
whole
contributed.
series is
Yes.
quite
Remarkable
fabulous.
and
Yeah,
daring. It's exactly
yeah.
what schools of architecture should be doing. And don't forget, I was almost an architect, so I knew a lot of those folk in the early days.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew the publisher actually. So all of this having been orchestrated and pulled together is everything that people from afar and people who see the truth of this place should be doing. So I can't think of a negative thought. I
No,
could try to
not at
figure
all.
one out
No.
if you would
Well,
like
that's
to press
okay.
me.
Well, thank you. I don't have any more questions. It's been a delightful project, and being able to see your house really was an enormous privilege, and having to grapple with how to represent that in words was certainly well worth the challenge. So,
Well, and if I haven't said it officially and effusively yet, thank you for what you
Yeah.
did, because I think you saw the house, the truth of it,
Yeah.
and
No,
not everybody does.
Yeah. I remember when you walked in, and as we had never met before, I thought, oh, well, what's she going to think, etc. And I could tell right away that you instantly saw what the house was about, and I was thrilled. So thank you.
well, thank you. It was one of those enjoyable projects, and I was so lucky to have that at the just at the end of my first career and
And
the
you were
entry to my
lucky that
next.
you had been
Yes.
newly retired, so had
Yes.
the time to do this.
Yes.
Yes,
Right.
yes, great. Well, thank you. And I also would like to thank the audience. And in concluding, I would like to thank Inform for its hosting of the event and the West Coast Modern House books that are to be found at Inform. And for the others involved in the McIntyre House book, Michael Perlmutter for the photographs, Laurent Vass for the quite elegant drawings, and Pablo Mandel for his graphic design. I also would like to thank Barry Griblin for his assistance with documentation and information on Cartelier Place. And I'd particularly like
Amen
to
to
thank
that, by the way, we should say that.
Okay.
Yes. And I would particularly like to thank Leslie Van Duzer for her initiation of an unwavering commitment to this West Coast Modern House series. And of course, to the McIntyres, who have been incredible hosts. And they've been also great helpers in assisting me with their memories and archives, and for the decades that you've looked after the house. So thank you.
Thank
And
you,
that's-
everybody.
Indeed, thanks all.
Okay, thank you.